Okay, it says we're live. We're good to go. Let's pray, and then we'll jump in tonight to Matthew 24. Father, we thank you for this evening and ask that as we study the words of Jesus tonight, that they would encourage us, Lord, that they would, um, Lord, give us understanding, Lord, and clarity where perhaps there's been confusion. So we just invite you to work through this text tonight, Lord, and give us, Lord, just a confidence in what your word says and confidence in what you say about the future. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. 2 weeks ago, we started to talk about what Jesus' teachings were regarding the end of the age. So we went through some of his parables and talked through those. If you need to review that or you weren't here, you can go back and watch. I think this is our 17th End Times class, so that was session 16. We began to then hit Matthew 23, which is the context for 24, okay? And that's really important because this isn't in isolation just by itself. It's within a greater context. And the context of Matthew 24 is the woes that Jesus pronounces over the religious leaders of Jerusalem. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And he calls out their hypocrisy. Then we have a lament over Jerusalem in verse 37 here. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that does what? That kills the prophets. Oftentimes I always challenge people to develop a correct historical perspective of the city of Jerusalem. Okay? I mean, we talk about Jerusalem in terms of this is Zion, the city of the king, the city where the temple was, where God, and all of those things are true. And yet, when Jesus hits the scene in the first century, his description of Jerusalem is none of those things. His description of the city of Jerusalem is the city that kills the prophets that God had sent. So he says, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. So the city of Jerusalem is not a holy city. It's a corrupt city. I mean, Jesus cleanses the temple, we could argue once or twice, at least once we know, maybe twice. It could have been a description of the same event in two different places or two separate events. But either way, I mean, Jesus looks at Jerusalem and just points out its utter wickedness and corruption at this point in its history. This is not what Jerusalem was supposed to be, a light to the nations. The place where God's holy temple was, where God dwelt. And so he says, oh, Jerusalem. So lest we get this idea, this incorrect idea of Jerusalem as this amazing, incredible, it was not. Not at this point in history, anyway. Oh, and by the way, even currently, presently, there's a lot of history in Jerusalem. But has anyone ever been to the present city, modern day Jerusalem? Okay, all right. Honestly, between the apostasy of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam and Judaism, Israel is no better place today than it was 2,000 years ago. There are some faithful Jewish people who are followers of Christ in Jerusalem. There is a faithful remnant even now in Jerusalem. And they have a very, very, very difficult life because the Jews hate them. The Jews that adhere to Judaism hate them. The Muslims hate them. They get some. Now, I mean, if you're Protestant, Jewish, living in Jerusalem, everybody's against you. It just is that way. And I say, well, even with the Catholics that are there and the Orthodox, don't they all kind of adhere to, hey, at least we're all Christian? No. I'll share a quick story with you. When we were over there in 2022, we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a, a fascinating place. Um, I'll just bring up a picture here real quick. Let me go. This is the outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Um, I won't get into it tonight. Obviously, there's been debate over history. This was built about the 2nd century as to whether or not this is the place where the resurrection took place, where actually the crucifixion and then the resurrection took place. Based on all the archaeological and historical evidence, I think there's a strong argument to be made that this is the actual place of the resurrection. I know some people say, well, what about the Garden Tomb? The Garden Tomb is a tourist trap over in Jerusalem. I mean, it's a nice place, you know, where they do services and things like that. There's just no possible way that that's where the actual resurrection took place. Some people try to make a case that it took place on the Mount of Olives. I think archaeologically, historically, within tradition and history, this is a pretty good place to be made that the resurrection did in fact take place here. A lot of Protestants have rejected this just because the Catholics venerate this place, but set that aside and just look at the historical record and the archaeological evidence, and it seems like, as I personally think, there's a lot of evidence for this. That's beside the point. You go to the Church of Holy Sepulchre, right? And you can line up and you can go inside here where they believe this is where the resurrection took place, and obviously you can tell this is not a Protestant church, right? This is very, very Catholic. So within the Church of Holy Sepulchre, there's actually 3 different kind of priests within kind of Christianity that have their sections of the Church of Holy Sepulchre that they oversee. All right, so I think you've got 2 different versions of some Orthodox Christianity, and you've got the Roman Catholics, right? And within the Church of Holy Sepulchre, these 3 different sets of priests, they do not get along even with each other. And they run into each other. They have arguments. They have fights. There's even violence that takes place. And you can see some of these videos even on YouTube about violence or fights that break out in the Church of Holy Sepulchre amongst these 3 separate groups of quote-unquote Christians. And then the Protestants come in. And so we come into the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and Brad was the name of our guide, and he takes us down to a section of the church, and it was really where there was an abandoned rock quarry where they believe this was actually probably Golgotha and the place where Christ was crucified. And so we're all this is not a great picture, it's the only one I have though, but we're all sitting down in this area, and he's talking about the gospel, right? We're talking about the cross, and we're talking about Jesus' death, and so it's just a really powerful moment for us in this moment where, man, you're sitting at the very place where Jesus quite possibly could have been hanging on a cross 2,000 years ago, right? So we're there listening to the teaching, going through the scriptures, you know, just really, you know, trying to take it all in. And one of the priests comes right down through this area, and this area is not a common area. A lot of people don't come down into this area. Some people do, but he made it a point to come down into this area and throw his incense all over the place and then leave. So we didn't think much of it. Okay, whatever. He just, you know, that's what he does. Before long, another priest comes down from completely different. Maybe it was the Catholic priest, and then one of the Orthodox priests comes down. He does the exact same thing, only he's a little more rude about it. He's like throwing incense all over us, you know. I don't know, like he's purifying the place from the dirty Protestants, I think is what's happening. And then he leaves. About 5 minutes later, the third comes down. So they all hate each other until they are all against the Protestants that come down. And so the third one comes down. He's the most antagonistic toward us, and he's throwing incense everywhere. And he starts to run his mouth a little bit. And I'm like, well, hey, don't start nothing. There won't be nothing. So, you know, like, I'm like, Brad, you want me to deal with this guy? Like, we'll take him out and deal with him the way we deal with stuff in Philly. Like, that's what, you know, like, let's do this. And that would not have been a good thing. And he yelled and screamed at us and told us we had to get out, which he's he has no right, no business doing that. But our leader Brad, he was a little nervous about the situation because that area is just a tinderbox of conflict, and there is violence that takes place, at the drop of a hat. Sometimes it's just a lot of intense emotions in this city, especially at these quote unquote holy sites. So we quietly kind of gathered our stuff and left, which bothered me. I'm like, I wanted to stand our ground, and like this guy's not going to tell us, but what do I know, right? And so he's like, he brought us out, and he said, and then he later explained to us exactly what was taking place, and and why we kind of needed to quietly leave at that moment, not to incite any more emotions and things like that. So when you think about the Jewish Christians who live in Jerusalem, the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Muslims, the adherents of Judaism want nothing to do with Christians who are living in Jerusalem and in Israel. It's just very difficult for them, as it was for the first century Christians. And so I say all that to say that the description of Jerusalem in Jesus' day was not one of, this is an amazing holy city. This is a corrupt, wicked city. And as amazing as it is to go to the city today and study the history and see where Jesus and let the Bible kind of come to life, outside of that, it's a pretty wicked, corrupt city even to this day. Mostly because just about everybody has completely and utterly rejected Christ. Even those who claim to be Christian Roman Catholics have added to the gospel and have created an apostate religion. And so when we think about Jerusalem, we can't look at Jerusalem with these rose-colored glasses. All right, we need to look at it for what it really is, and what Jesus described it as: the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. So therefore, verse 38, see, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so Jesus mentions this statement here of coming in the name of the Lord. And so we have to ask the question, what is Jesus referring to? We might automatically assume he's referencing his second coming. Because as he leaves and goes away, his disciples came and point to him the buildings of the temple. Jesus, what of this temple? What of the glory of Jerusalem? This is the city of the great king, the city of the temple, right? As they would have looked upon the city of Jerusalem as they were going up to the Mount of Olives. And again, I'll just show you a quick picture. This is just a picture of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. It's quite a view, and imagine that not a mosque being there, but rather a temple being there. I mean, look at Jerusalem as they're standing on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city. Look at the Temple Mount. Look how massive it is. Look how glorious it is. Look how amazing it is. If you go to the museum in Jerusalem, you can see what they have, a model of what the first century city of Jerusalem looked like, right? And so this is the Kidron Valley, and then the Mount of Olives would have been up this way. So I mean, look at the temple just in relation to the city itself. It takes up a massive part of the city. I mean, look how incredible this temple is. Look how glorious all of this is. I mean, look at that, right? This is the city of Jerusalem, right? This is, the temple. This is the city of the King. And so Jesus' response is, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone standing upon another that will not be thrown down. And I think I showed you these pictures last time. I'll bring them up again just as a way of remembrance here. Um, they still have the stones from the original temple that lay at the base of the Temple Mount to this day. All right, so this is Jesus' prophecy coming, just on display for everyone that walks by there to this very day. What Jesus said would happen 2,000 years ago, we still have the evidence of that. So, upon hearing that the temple would be destroyed, not one stone would be left standing upon another, would have been devastating for these disciples. See, what was their expectation at this point? Well, I tell you, the expectation for the disciples is quite, frankly, the expectation for the modern day millennialists that, no, one day this glorious temple will stand and Jesus, the Messiah, will rule on the throne and the glory of Israel will be established once again. And that was what the disciples expected. For Jesus to raise up an army, or through his power, expel the Roman occupation of Jerusalem, restore the glories of the Davidic throne once again, and rule on the throne of his father David. After all, that's what the Old Testament promises, is it not? And so that was the expectation for the first century apostles, which is coincidentally the expectation of the modern day millennialists. That didn't happen in the first century, we know that, but that's going to happen when God picks up his redemptive plan for the Jewish people. But is that what the Bible teaches? And is that what Jesus is teaching here? And so Jesus goes on and says, the temple's going to be destroyed. Not one stone will be left standing upon another. That will not be thrown down. It's all going to be taken apart piece by piece. And so he sat on the Mount of Olives in verse 3. And so again, the context is the woes against Jerusalem. Your house will be left to you desolate. Basically, the temple will be destroyed. There's judgment coming. And he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age. And so here's the biggest question is, what are the disciples asking when they ask what will be the sign of your coming? What do they understand is coming to be, and what do they understand the end of the age to be? Okay, so you can't assume that they know and understand what we know with all of the scriptures now, right? What is it that they're anticipating? And I would argue that their understanding of the age was there is this old covenant Jewish age that with the inauguration of a new covenant will come to an end in the dawn of a new age. But Jesus has also said, I say to you, blessed, see your house is left to you desolate. Verse 38, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So therefore, when will your coming be, and when will be the end of the age? And so they are taking, I believe, the coming of Jesus and the end of the age to be the same thing. And they're asking, when is this going to happen? I don't know what kind of an understanding at this point they had of Jesus ascending to the Father and then coming again as a second coming in the way that we understand it. Why? Because even when Jesus ascended into heaven, they seemed shocked and surprised by that. Like he's going up. They're like Jesus had just given them the mission, the Great Commission, go make disciples. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, other ends of the earth. And he starts floating up. And they're like, and then the angel's like, don't worry, it's cool. Because, Jesus had said, hey, I've got to go away and I'm going to send the Comforter. So we see that there were times where Jesus was pretty clear, but the disciples still didn't quite get it. So the angel's like, don't worry about it, don't be afraid. Because in the same way that you saw him leave, he's going to come again. And like, oh, well, that's good news. But that wasn't at this point, right? And so him coming to do something, most likely to bring judgment upon Jerusalem. When are you going to come and judge Jerusalem, which will then also mark the end of the age? I think, and I argue that's what they were asking. That was their understanding. Jesus, when are you going to come? And when are you... So if you read Old Testament text, Old Testament text in judgment language talk of Yahweh coming in the clouds to inflict judgment upon Egypt. So you go through some of the prophecies of the Old Testament prophets, major and minor prophets, and you'll see similar language of Yahweh coming. He's coming in judgment. And so there was this understanding from the Hebrew Scriptures that there is a coming of God in judgment upon those to whom he's going to inflict his wrath. Seems as though that is pretty clearly what's happening within the context of Jerusalem here. When are you going to come, inflict your wrath? Jerusalem will be destroyed, the temple will be destroyed, which will then what? That's got to clearly mark the end of this age and the dawn of a new age. So let's see what Jesus says. So let's go through and see how Jesus answers then. He says, see that no one leads you astray. Okay, so who's he talking to? His disciples, right? In the first century. See that no one leads you astray, disciples. For many will come in my name. Now, Jesus knew what was going to take place. He knew he was going to ascend into heaven. And after that, many would come in my name saying, I'm the Christ. And they will lead many astray. And we know that in the first century, that's exactly what took place. Many false apostles and false messiahs. And quite frankly, there have been to this very day. I mean, Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem, they're still looking for their Messiah to come. You go to Jerusalem today, there's posters of these rabbis saying, the Messiah, he's the Messiah, or we think he's the Messiah, or we want him to be the Messiah. And by the way, their concept of Messiah is not our understanding of Messiah, come and provide redemption and salvation. And their concept of Messiah is more of a religious political ruler. Right? They're still very much like they were in the first century. It's all about the people of Israel, ethnic Jewish people, having their land, having their city, having their king, having their freedom, having the glory of the Davidic throne once again. Okay, so their concept of Messiah is not a biblical concept of Messiah in the way that we understand it. Then he says this, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Okay, well, first century Middle Eastern history tells us what? There were a couple of wars, right? Yeah, I mean, even with the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, once the Jewish wars started, which we're going to touch on that in just a little bit, and you can read of the Jewish historian Josephus, who was not a Christian, but he was Jewish, wrote of the Jewish wars. Within Israel, there were these zealots, right? In fact, Simon, one of the apostles, was one of these zealots. These zealots were like these secret assassins who would go and undercover kill and undermine the Roman authorities. You've got to, I mean, at some point, if you have the chance to go to Israel and go to Masada and hear the story of Masada, which was the fortress of Herod, glorious, just incredible fortress that he built out in the middle of nowhere on this kind of mountain that had no access up except for a trail, and built this palace up there, this luxurious palace, and he had water kind of piped in from the desert when it would rain into these cisterns, and he had pools, and it was really incredible, and yet some of these zealots, when the Roman army came against the Jewish people, some of these zealots took refuge at Masada, and then they built this ramp up to Masada, and they eventually got them. Just little by little, they built this. I got to show you a picture of this. If you've never seen the Masada pictures, it's really quite something. That's Masada right there, right? This is the ramp the Roman army built up to the Masada. So the fortress was up here. His palace was on the end here, and the Roman army, this hill wasn't here. You can walk up that now. In fact, we walked up this to the top of Masada, but it wasn't there. So little by little, the Roman army kept piling dirt, until they were able to get up to the zealots and basically just kill all of them. And so here's the it's just amazing, because even as you walk up this trail here, you can see that they packed wood and trash and garbage from the first century in to kind of keep the dirt together. And so as you're walking this, you can see logs and pieces of wood sticking out from 2,000 years ago. That's actually pretty incredible. But you can even see part of the palace ruins up at the top there of Masada. Um, and there's Steph making her way up the path to Masada. Um, and yet this is just the area surrounding. You can tell there's just nothing there. This is part of Herod's palace that he built up there. This was his bathhouse. And this is what it looks like at Masada. So this is where they took refuge, but this is where the Roman army, this was what his palace looked like when it was actually there at the top of that mountain. This area here, that was the Roman encampment. So that's where they camped for, boy, I don't know how many months and years. I think it was like 18 months or something like it took them to build that ramp up so they could what they wanted to do is get rid of all of the zealots, stamp them out, and get rid of them completely. So the Romans were brutal with their treatment of their enemies. And so this was a Roman camp that they just lived in for months upon months while they eventually built the ramp up to eventually take the fortress of Masada from. So they built this ramp up and then took those that were taking refuge there. So when Jesus says, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So in other words, there's going to be a lot of wars. Even before the Jewish wars started, there was all skirmishes everywhere. And so what Jesus is saying to them is, listen, there's going to be a final kind of coming against Jerusalem. But before that, you're going to hear a lot of wars and rumors of wars. But don't let that alarm you. The end of Jerusalem is not yet. Okay? So just don't let that freak you out, guys, when you hear, oh, war's coming, okay, because Jesus is going to say it's going to get pretty scary, but the end's not yet, because he says nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, earthquakes in various places, but these are the beginning of what Jesus says are birth pains. So, again, read first century history. There was widespread famines through this time. Certainly, the area was racked with earthquakes. If you go to the modern city of, if I can find it here. This was a first century Greco-Roman city in Jerusalem. This was the city by the name slip, and it was a city where they hung the bodies of Saul and Jonathan after they had been killed. That was this city here. It later became, it was always a Gentile city, and then later became a Greco-Roman city. But you can see the group walking here, and you can see the massive pillars, the Greco-Roman pillars that fell. Well, why did they fall? Because there were so many earthquakes in the first century during this time that most of these pillars, these have been reconstructed and put back. They kind of were able to piece them back together. These all had fallen down at some point in an earthquake. And so I like this picture, and that's why I took that, because it just shows you the devastation of the earthquakes that took place there in the first century. And so, because this is an original first century road here, and you can see this pillar came down and just destroyed these massive rocks that were part of this road that is actually in pretty good shape 2,000 years later, right? Better than a lot of Pennsylvania roads anyway. But the Romans knew how to build roads and make them last. So Jesus says, hey, there's going to be famines and earthquakes in various places. But he says these are the beginning of the birth pains. Now, birth pain imagery is what? All right, for those of you ladies who have gone through labor, God bless you. It looks horrible. Um, but it starts out not terrible, right? It starts out, okay, there's something going on here. But then as it progresses, it gets a lot worse, right? The birth pains become more intense and more frequent the closer you get to the end. So Jesus is giving that type of analogy here to say, hey, you're going to see these things that will kind of be normal kind of indications of the age that you're living in, but they will intensify the closer you get toward the coming end of Jerusalem. And then he says this, they will deliver you, my disciples. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, right? So I even gave you just a microcosm of what the Jewish people, even in Jerusalem now, face. In the first century, it was even far worse. The two main enemies of the Christians in the first century were the Roman Empire and the religious Jewish people. The Jewish people had a special exemption under Roman rule to worship how they wanted. That's why they were able to have their temple and everything. Yeah, you're good, as long as you're not a threat. But what happened is, as the Jewish people began to turn to Christ, the religious Jews weren't happy about it. They were threatened by it because the gospel began to spread so rapidly in Jerusalem and Judea and in Samaria that what the Jewish people who rejected Christ started doing was they started turning in their Christian brothers and sisters to the Roman Empire, saying, these people are not us. These people are a different, religion. They're a threat to Rome. They're anti-Roman. And then Rome would come and arrest them. And the Roman persecution against Christians started to heat up as a result of the Jewish people turning in the Christians that lived in Jerusalem and in Judea. And so Jesus is saying, you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then he said, many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Well, I just explained that to you. Okay, the Jewish people who rejected Christ would betray even their own family members. So if you became a Christian, and that's why Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace, but I came to be a sword. I came to bring a sword, to set a father against a son and a mother against a daughter. Those of your own household will be your enemies. Like this, following me, taking up your cross and following me means you may face the rejection of those who are closest to you in your family. And so that certainly takes place even to this day, but did at an incredibly difficult way in the first century. It says, many false prophets will rise and lead many astray. And so if you look at the first century, even during the time of Paul and the apostles and their teaching, there was just so much false Christology and false teachings that arose, even amongst the agnostics, amongst the Judaizers. We talked about that in our study through Galatians. So much false teaching that arose that they had to combat during those days. It says, because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, so there's this idea that if you don't fall away because of the persecution, if you remember, the book of Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians who were tempted to fall away from Christianity and go back to Judaism because it was safe. The whole point of the book of Hebrews, it says, if you go back to Judaism, understand there is no salvation there. There is nothing to go back to. Why? Because Christ has come and inaugurated a new covenant. The old is done, the new is here. So there's nothing to go back to. You'll go back to condemnation. And so Jesus is saying, if you don't fall away, but you endure the persecution, you endure the difficulty to the end, there is salvation in the end. Then an interesting statement. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, then the end will come. So this is where dispensational theology particularly latches onto this and says, see, the gospel of the kingdom did not go to all nations in the first century, therefore this could not be accomplished in the first century. That means it has to be future. And it seems pretty compelling, right? If you read it through the lens of a modern Western mindset. What do we understand the whole world to be? Well, we have pictures from space. We know what planet Earth looks like. We know where all of the land is. We know where all of the nations are. We can put up a map and a globe and say, this is the Earth. For us, the whole world is indeed the whole planet Earth. But that is not how they understood the world to be in the first century, I can tell you that. You cannot assume that the people of the first century, even Jesus, who understands, is speaking to them within their language and in their context. What was the world for the first century Christian? And the way they talked about it. It was Rome. That for them, that was the world. That was the nations, right? They didn't even have a concept of anything beyond the Roman Empire. Most of these people grew up and never went more than 100 miles from their home. So the way they talked about the nations was Rome. That's the world. So Jesus says the gospel will be proclaimed basically throughout your world. And then this end will come. And so even the Apostle Paul makes statements, and I wish I can't think of the text off the top of my head, about the gospel has now been proclaimed throughout the world. And so there isn't this very strict, literal, like every single nation has had the gospel preached to them. That's not how they would have understood it. That's not how they would have communicated it. Even Paul himself makes the statement that the gospel has gone to the world. What? Through the proclamation of his missionary journeys and the message of the apostles going out throughout Asia Minor and into the Roman Empire. And so even if you follow the gospel as it went throughout all of the apostles, and even if you follow church history's history of the original apostles and where they went, many of them went way beyond Rome, I'm sorry, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and into northern Africa, across the Jordan into the east, and then obviously we know Paul went up into Asia Minor. And from there, the gospel multiplied at such a rapid rate that the gospel began to spread so fast throughout the Roman Empire that within the first 30, 40 years of Christianity, the gospel had kind of reached a lot of different parts of the Roman Empire to the point where Paul could say, hey, the gospel's gone to the world. So there's very much a first century idea that what Jesus is saying is, hey, I'm talking to you guys living right now in this time period. You expect this to happen. You can understand that this is something that you would expect to happen in your lifetime. And that just on its face seems to be the very literal, plain reading of this text. But then we get to the infamous abomination of desolation in verse 15. So Jesus says this, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Okay. So what's this abomination of desolation? And so we know the holy place is referencing the temple, right? We already know that there had been previous abominations like that of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he came in and desecrated the temple and offered a pig on the altar. So Jesus is referencing even something like that, saying when you see something like that, and even references Daniel, when Daniel proclaims that desolations are decreed about the city of Jerusalem. He says, when you see this abomination of desolation, you need to do something. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so this is a specific warning to who? People in Kansas? People in Quakertown? No. People that live where? Well, because I take the Bible literally, all right? Judea. So when you see this abomination of desolation, which we're going to focus on that in just a minute, this seems to be a local thing. Flee to where? To mountains. Well, that makes sense because in and around Jerusalem, Judea and the Judean wilderness, it's a mountainous area. For them, mountains. I grew up in Colorado, not great mountains, but they're for them mountains. And hills, big hills, okay? But flee to mountains, right? So if you're not in Judea, like I said, if you're in Kansas, there's no fleeing to mountains. right? So this seems to be a local issue that Jesus is talking about. Again, keep in mind the greater context is his lament over Jerusalem. So it makes sense that Jesus would then say, those who are in Judea, well, guess where Jerusalem was, right? Judea, go to the mountains. So if you're in Judea, let the one who is on the housetop, again, those in Judea, if you're on the housetop, when you see this, don't go down and take what is in your house. Let the one who's in the field not turn and take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter on Sabbath. Right? So when you see this abomination, get out of Dodge. Get out of Judea. And man, Jesus intensifies the urgency by giving these, like, hey, if you're on your housetop, don't even go down. If you're in the field, don't even go get your cloak. Like, why? Because there will be great tribulation coming, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So what's he talking about? This abomination of desolation, I believe, a writer named Sam Storms, he's a pastor who wrote a book on eschatology, and so this is his understanding of his chapter on Matthew 24. And I think he makes a good point here when he says the most popular identification of the abomination of desolation is Titus and the armies of Rome. So Titus was sent during the Jewish wars, of which Josephus writes a lot about, to go and end this Jewish rebellion by these Jewish zealots. And what greater way to do that than to just take Jerusalem itself? So the army marches toward Jerusalem. And so while the city of Jerusalem was still he says was still burning, the soldiers brought I'm not going to hit that yet. I'm going to say identifying Titus's armies with the abomination of desolation is the most popular because it seems to parallel the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes, which I talked about in the 2nd century. But it's important to note, what I want to draw your attention to is Luke 21. So let me take you to Luke 21, because Luke writes about the Olivet Discourse himself, and I want you to see his language here. In Luke 21, it's very similar. This is Luke's accounting. They asked him, "Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of when these things are about to take place?" So Luke's actually writing to a Gentile audience, while Matthew's writing to more of a Jewish audience. And so Luke describes it in different language that a Gentile audience would understand. So when Luke describes the Olivet Discourse, he describes the question as, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Well, as Gentiles, that actually makes a little more sense to us, right? And so Jesus says the temple will be destroyed, and so Luke says, hey, we all asked him, hey, when will be the destruction of the temple? And what will be the sign of the destruction of the temple and what he knew to be the end of the age and the beginning of a new age? So he says, see that you're not led astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he. The time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be afraid. Do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Okay, so it's very similar, right? He's more of a condensed version of what Matthew was saying. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, famines, pestilence, terrors, great signs from heaven. But before all of this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, deliver you up to the synagogues and prisons, and be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. Okay, very similar language that Matthew was using. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. I will give you a mouth and wisdom, what to say. You'll be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your life. So it's very similar language. He who endures to the end will be saved. Luke basically says it a little differently. By your endurance you will gain your lives, right? You don't fall away, you stay faithful. But then verse 20. How does Luke describe what Matthew says is the abomination of desolation? Well, Luke's a little more clear. Luke says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that what? Its desolation has come. So Luke gives us more clarity that the desolation is what? The surrounding of Jerusalem by a foreign army. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart. Right? And then basically the same thing Matthew says. So what Matthew says is the abomination of desolation, which we're left to kind of say, okay, what is that? Luke says, oh, it's easy. It's when an army surrounds Jerusalem. Which the Jewish people would have made that connection probably more easily than a Gentile audience. That's why Luke's a little more descriptive in communicating to a Gentile audience what Matthew says is an abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation, this abomination that makes the temple desolate is a Roman army coming in to, well, he doesn't say Roman army, he just says an army surrounding Jerusalem. So, let me go. Here, and let's just read what Storm says, because I think I find it helpful. If you go to the top here, we see the reason for the extreme urgency of the escape. Like when you see an army surrounding Jerusalem, that's your sign. Get out of Judea and flee to the mountains. So the reference is to the events of April through September in 70 AD when Josephus wrote, who was a Jewish author and historian, who wrote a comprehensive 200 pages of an eyewitness account called The Wars of the Jews, of the Jewish revolt and the fall of Jerusalem. His book was first published in 75 AD when the facts of this Holocaust were still vividly in the minds of many. Okay, now notice the description here. When the war broke out in 66 AD between Rome and the Jewish people, it intensified a continuation of hostilities that had been brewing for years. Jerusalem was the last Jewish stronghold and was the focus of Rome's most brutal rage. Multitudes of thieves, zealots, and murderers had flocked to the city seeking refuge. So all these zealots it was the last remaining city of refuge to escape the brutality of the Roman army. And so the city was without law and order. Chaos and anarchy reigned. The city divided into warring factions who took turns attacking each other. In one incident, more than 12,000 of the city's nobles and leading citizens were tortured and killed by the zealots. Those who tried to escape had their throats slit, their bodies were left to rot in the streets. Burial became an impossibility, and huge piles of cadavers filled the streets or were thrown from the city's walls. Notice Jesus says there's coming a time in Jerusalem of great tribulation, such as it has never seen or never will see. Josephus writes of it, saying this, the noise of those that were fighting was incessant, both by day and by night, but the lamentations of those who mourned exceeded the noise of the fighting. They, moreover, were continually inventing pernicious things against each other, and when they had resolved upon anything, they executed it without mercy and omitted no method of torment or of barbary. Then the Passover came, and there was a lull in hostilities, and the city gates were open for a while, and the population of the city swelled. So this is what's going on in the city before Rome even comes. Well, the Roman general Vespasian was recalled because of Nero's death and was himself soon declared emperor. His son Titus assumed the responsibility for the battle. He repeatedly offered clemency to the Jews and often sent Josephus to the walls of the city to appeal for their surrender. Famine soon set in, and the city's granaries and storehouses were deliberately burned, and water reservoirs were polluted. Again, notice what Josephus says. The madness of the seditions did also increase together with their famine, and both those miseries were every day inflamed more and more, for there was no corn that appeared anywhere publicly. It was now a miserable case and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, insomuch that children would pull the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their mouths. So did mothers to their infants. And so, people not only sold their homes, but also their children to obtain food. People in the city of Jerusalem regularly ate from public sewers, cattle and pigeon dung, leather shields, hay, clothing, and things that scavenger dogs would not even dare touch. Unbelievable forms of torture were inflicted on those who were suspected of hiding food. Again, Josephus says, "It is impossible to give every instance of the iniquity of these men. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world." Josephus was not a Christian, and he almost repeated exactly the words that Jesus described some 30-some years earlier. So in desperation, some left the city at night to find food, but were captured by the Romans. Thousands were crucified in plain sight of the city walls, often at a rate of 500 per day. So many were killed in this manner that room was wanting for crosses, and crosses wanting for bodies. After several unsuccessful assaults on the city, Titus ordered his troops to surround the city with a wall to cut off any remaining avenues of escape. Seemingly in fulfillment of Jesus' word, "Thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, encompass you around, and keep you on every side." He said that in Luke 19. This served to intensify the famine. And so, what we know from history is this: that the Romans sent an army to deal with the last stronghold of the Jewish people, to end the Jewish wars. And they came to surround the city of Jerusalem, but they were called back. So there was an army, a Roman army that came, and they were about to siege the city of Jerusalem, and then they were called back. And when that happened, those who believed the words of Jesus obeyed the words of Jesus. And those Christians left the city of Jerusalem and fled it. And they went to a place called Pella, where they were protected and nourished and provided for, while the things that I've just read to you from Josephus took place inside the city. So those who believed the words of Jesus, when you see an army surrounding Jerusalem, leave the city immediately. And when they saw that first assault coming, and then it turned away, all of those Christians left. And they were spared. Then Josephus goes on to say, "Then did the famine widen its progress, and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were filled with women and children dying of the famine. The lanes of the city were full of dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with famine, and fell down dead wherever their misery seized them. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day, and indeed the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another was a horrible sight, and produced a pestilential stench which was a hindrance to those who would make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy." Josephus tells of one woman who killed her son, roasted his body, and ate half of him, and hid the remaining half. When the smell drew others desperate for food, she offered to share his body, inciting horror among the multitudes. I believe this is what Jesus was warning when he says there will be a time of great tribulation, such as this city has never seen nor ever will see. So when Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation, I believe he's talking about the events that took place here in 70 AD. the events that the people who believed the words of Jesus, when they saw the cities of surrounding Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation, that they did what? That they left. And history tells us they did exactly that, went into Pella, and were spared there. Well, eventually, while Josephus goes on to say, while the holy house was on fire, this is the temple, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those who were caught were slain. Nor was there commensuration of any age or any reverence of gravity, but children, old men, profane persons, and priests were all slain in the same manner. Moreover, many, when they saw the fire, exerted their utmost strength, and did break out into groans and outcries. Perea also did return the echo, as well as the mountains around Jerusalem, and augmented the force of the noise. Yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, as if full of fire on every part, that the blood was more in quantity than the fire, and that the slain were more in numbers than they who slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible, because of the dead bodies that lay upon it. And upon the burning of the wood and the cedar that would have been part of the furnishings and the structure of the temple, the gold that covered the temple would have also begun to melt and go into the drainage channels that would have been a part of the temple, at which point the Roman soldiers began to take apart the temple brick by brick to get to the gold, so that not one stone was left standing upon another. And so Josephus reports of the activity of numerous false prophets who misled people and contributed to their demise. And he goes on to say, they went into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn and slew those whom they overtook without mercy, and set fire to the houses whither the Jews had fled, and burnt every soul in them. They ran every one through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many houses was quenched with these men's blood. The afflictions which befell the Jews were the greatest of all those, not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations. It appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to those of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. It's fascinating that as brutal as the Romans had been to their enemies, Josephus says this was the worst he had ever seen. And so it's just stunning that in verse 21, Jesus describes this event to be such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And so many insist that this great tribulation cannot refer to the events of 70 AD because worse events happened, blah, blah, blah. But Jesus is speaking within the context of and to be honest with you, I mean, who can say, oh, well, World War II was worse, or this was worse? Jesus is talking in a hyperbolic, prophetic, dramatic sense to heighten their awareness that, hey, when these things come, get out and be protected. And so, once one's, just want to make note here, once one grasps the dimensions of what occurred in 70 AD, one realizes that the savagery, cruelty, and the monstrosities that occurred were beyond comparison. Also, never so high a percentage of one city's population was destroyed. Everyone was either killed or sold into slavery. And as noted earlier, approximations are that 1.1 million people were killed and 100,000 were enslaved. And so, when we now read the history of what happened from the eyewitnesses, namely through the writings of Josephus that we just read, we understand the words of Jesus. If he's referring to these events, we understand the gravity of what Jesus was saying and why the people that believed Jesus' words left Jerusalem and fled to the mountains, fled to Pella when they saw the army surrounding Jerusalem. So verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand, so I say to you, look. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And so I think this is very consistent language of the coming of the Son of Man, but not in reference to his second coming, but in his coming upon Jerusalem in judgment. So we see this language throughout the Old Testament of God coming in judgment, even him coming on the clouds in judgment of Egypt. And so Jesus uses that same language that they were very familiar with from the Old Testament, saying the Son of Man will come in judgment upon Jerusalem. And I think that's what he's prophesying here. And so I don't believe that Jesus is talking about future events thousands of years in the future. I think it's very clear he's talking to that audience for that day, because he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. This is very apocalyptic type of judgment language that you see throughout even the Old Testament. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. I'm going to reference next week Old Testament text that use the same language. With power and great glory, he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to another. And so we have to talk about this. Is Jesus switching, and is now Jesus kind of pointing toward another coming of judgment? And so I do think there's some merit that what we saw happen, or what we can read about happening in Jerusalem in 70 AD, is but a foreshadowing of the second coming of Jesus, when he will come and he will execute his justice upon the wicked of the earth. So I think there's something to be said for him saying, hey, this is almost a type and a shadow of, yes, I'm ending the Jewish age. It is now the dawn of the Messianic age and the gospel of the kingdom going out. But what I've done is I've come in judgment upon Jerusalem, which is a foreshadowing of the future coming of Jesus, which will be what? A coming in judgment, but also coming in the gathering of his elect. So the elect were protected in the 70 AD because they believed Jesus and they fled, and they were protected from the judgment of God there. In the same way, at Jesus' second coming, we will be taken out, and then judgment will fall upon those who are left. And so he goes on to say, learn from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender, puts out its leaves, know that summer is near. So also when you see all of these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. And then you have this statement here, which we talked about earlier. Truly I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And so we have this infamous, this generation. I think is very clearly talking to the disciples in front of him. You disciples, this generation that we're living in right now will not pass away until all of these things I've said about take place. So I think it's actually pretty clear that Jesus is describing events that they were expected to see within their lifetimes, within their generation, not some future generation thousands of years in the future. And so one of the questions I always ask, and I always asked these questions when I was going through seminary, how do we teach, how do we preach these texts that for the first century disciples were future prophecy, but for us are now past things that, right, for them was future, for us are past. One of the most powerful things about the Olivet Discourse, as he talks about the impending coming of judgment upon Jerusalem, is just this incredible fulfillment that, like, it is powerful to read the words of Jesus, and then some 30-some years later, we can read from the words of Josephus, not a Christian, just a historian, describing exactly what Jesus said would happen. To go to Jerusalem and see the stones that are still there to this day from the destruction of that temple. Like what that does is that stirs within me anyway this confidence that what Jesus proclaimed to be true actually took place exactly in the way that he said it would. It puts within me a great deal of confidence that yes, we can believe the words of Christ. That yes, he was a prophet, right? The threefold office of Christ of prophet, priest, and king. As a prophet, what he proclaimed came to pass. What he said was true. Like you may have a lot of questions about the Bible and about stuff in the Old Testament and this or that or the other. And those things we need to wrestle with. But at the end of the day, Jesus proclaimed these things and they came to pass. It's stunning how exactly the prophecy that Jesus gave came to pass. And so as we study eschatology, now we can look at the future promises of Jesus, and we'll get into this a little bit, we'll get into a lot next week because we're out of time now. Because then we have this, concerning the day or the hour, no one knows, not even the Son. So we're going to complete the Olivet Discourse and go into Matthew 25. Because when we hit Matthew 25, all of a sudden there seems to be a shift where he's not talking about first century 70 AD stuff. It seems as though he's actually talking about a day when he comes where he'll separate the wheat from the tares or the sheep from the goats. He'll say to those on the goats on his right, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Right? He'll say to the sheep, "Enter into the glory of," right? And so it seems as though Jesus talks about the coming and judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD. And this is my personal kind of view. I think he jumps and then starts talking about what? A final day of judgment, an eschatological day of his coming, where he will not just deal with one local judgment, but it'll be a cosmic global judgment. But not before he separates the wheat from the tares and the sheep from the goats. And so I do believe that Jesus is, in his prophecy of 70 AD and what happened with Jerusalem, is saying this is the end of that age, the end of this Jewish Old Covenant age, the dawn of the New Covenant Messianic age. But in some way, I think it also foreshadows and points to his second coming, in which he will judge the world, raise the dead, and make all things new. So that's all we have time for tonight. We'll pick it up with the rest of it next week. Then we'll kind of start walking through the book of Revelation. I figure we've got about 5 or 6 more sessions in our time here, and then we'll be done. So we will meet next week. Yep, I think I'm available next week, so we'll get done here definitely this fall before the end of this year. So any questions? I know some of you have sent me some questions email wise, and I am working on those, trying to get those. It's been a lot on my plate with worship leader transition and stuff like that. But I do want to get to those questions. Any questions about anything we went over tonight? Yeah, Bill. I just want to make sure everything's still clear. So if you go back to verse 27. Mm-hmm. So we're saying the 27 coming of the Son of Man. Yep. Visible, actual. Yeah. So, yep. Coming in judgment. Yep. Okay. Yep. That's. And this is why some who are what we call preterist, full-blown preterism says that Jesus actually came in 70 AD and there's no other coming. That's heresy. Okay? So then you have what's a partial preterist view that says, no, he's using judgment language to talk about coming in judgment, but not referencing his second bodily coming. Yes, correct. Yeah. If you go back to verse 3, it says, they ask, when will these things be? So these things would refer to what he said in verse 2. Yeah. Right, that's what they're asking about. Mm-hmm. So I would say that these things, when they ask them the coming of the end of the age, they're equating these things in verse 2. Mm-hmm. They're thinking that's the end of the age. Yep, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple. In their mind, they're like, this is the end of this age. What could be worse than the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple for them? That had to have, that was monumental. And so, yeah, I think they're asking, they're combining. And I think Luke, in his explanation, remember what Luke says? Yeah, right? Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place. What? Well, Jerusalem being destroyed, the temple being destroyed. So, yeah. So when you compare Luke's statements with Matthew's and understand there are a couple different audiences, I think that brings a lot of clarity to it. So, which is coincidentally, be honest with you, if this interpretation is correct, it's a pretty big dagger in the heart of pre-tribulational eschatology, that Jesus never taught a future 7-year tribulation period. Then you're only left with how do you deal with Daniel 9 and finding an antichrist in a future covenant with Israel there. I think it's just very difficult biblically and textually and exegetically. So this is why a lot of, even in my own journey, you're like, okay, so yeah, it doesn't seem as though as though Daniel's 70th week has this gap between the 69th and 70th week, and it seems that they run consecutive, and that perhaps this does conclude with the destruction of Jerusalem, and now we're in the latter half of Daniel's 70th week. And so I even made that transition myself, but then we still have the question of, okay, maybe we jump over that hurdle, maybe dispensational pre-tribulationalism. The Bible doesn't clearly teach that. But what about this question? Does God have a future plan in his redemptive plan for Jerusalem and the Jewish people in the city of Jerusalem? Right, that's millennialism, right? So we've kind of talked through the tribulation, right? And so tried to explain the amillennial, postmillennial approach to this is why we don't believe in a future tribulation period. Tribulation took place already for the Jewish people in 70 AD. But now we have to talk about, and we're going to do this through our study of Revelation, and particularly Revelation 20, what is the 1,000 years? Is there a future for ethnic Israel where the people get their kingdom? Or is the kingdom of God something about something much greater than Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem? So, but we'll get there. So, okay. Any other questions? All right, let's pray. God, thank you for your word. I thank you that it is true, and I thank you that we can believe with confidence the words of Jesus. And so give us a deep sense of confidence in what your word says as we leave tonight, to proclaim it with confidence and with boldness to a lost and dying world. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good week.